Chapter 20. Sometimes in the morning, prisoners didn't wake up. They were dead or dying. The guards would come in and beat their bodies to make sure they weren't faking it, and while we were gone or to roll call or on a work detail, the bodies would disappear, carted off to the furnaces to burn like the rest. One morning, the man in the bunk next to me didn't wake. I knew what death looked like by now. Death and I had become old acquaintances. We knew each other when we passed on the street. This man was dead, I was sure. "What is it?" another prisoner asked me. He was a boy, like me, maybe 1 or 2 years older. "This man is dead," I told him. The boy poked him to be sure, then looked around to see if the capos were coming yet. "Go through his pockets," he said. "What?" I was terribly surprised by his words. "See if he still has any bread on him." It sounded awful, but if the man did have food on him, he definitely didn't need it anymore. I put my hands in the pockets of his striped jacket and found a lice-ridden piece of bread from last night's dinner. I brushed off tore the bread in half, and gave half to the other boy. We scarfed down the bread before the capos came. The boy introduced himself to me as Fred. I told him my name, Yannick, not B3087. I hadn't spoken my name to anyone for as long as I could remember. Fred and I shook hands. It was the first intentional contact I'd had with anyone at the camps since Uncle Moshe died. We were all the time touching other people, lined up at roll call, at work, in line to get food, in bed at night, but I hadn't shaken hands or hugged on purpose in months. It felt good to connect with someone, even though Uncle Moshe's words came back at me again. You have no name, no personality, no family, no friends, nothing to identify you, nothing to care about, not if you want to survive. Fred and I stood together at roll call, but of course we didn't say a word to each other the whole time. When it was time for work detail, we were assigned together to the gravel pit, where we worked side by side breaking rocks. "Where are you from?" Fred asked me while we worked. I hesitated, remembering Uncle Moshe's warnings. But Fred was the first person close to my age I'd met since hiding under the floors in Plazo with Isaac and Thomas. I loved just talking again, being human. "Krakow," I told him. "Me too," Fred said. We compared streets and discovered we had grown up not too far from each other. We even went to some of the same parks and stores. "Every day I would walk my sister to school down Krakusa Street," he said, remembering. Then he got very quiet. "Where is she now?" I asked. "She and my parents came here with me. I was sent to the right, and they were sent to the left." I knew what that meant. We all did. His family was dead. Overhead we heard the drone of airplanes, and we all looked up. "British planes," someone whispered. I didn't know how they could tell, but I hoped that they were right. How they could tell, British airplanes meant Allies were advancing, taking the fight to the Germans. The Allies were the forces aligned against Germany, England, France, America, and the rest. The capos cracked their whips and made us all get back to work, but soon we heard explosions in the distance. The Allies were bombing close by. "Sometimes I wish the Allies would drop bombs on us," Fred said. "Blow this place to bits, and all the Nazis and the capos with it. And me too." "We can't give up," I told him. "We have to survive." Fred tried to smile, but I could tell he was still thinking about his family. He didn't say anything more the rest of the morning. It was only at lunch that he felt like talking again. He lifted a spoonful of tepid, flavorless broth and poured it back into his bowl. "You know what I'm going to do first thing when I get out of the camps? I'm going to buy a big, warm, golden loaf of bread. Then I'm going to slick off a thick piece, and I'm going to spread butter all over it and eat it in 3 bites. I laughed. "I'll take 5 pastries. Oh, and bagels, 3 of those. With cream cheese, carrot cake with walnuts, chocolate pudding." Just talking about all the delicious food made my stomach rumble, but it was fun to dream. We kept up our running menu all through work in the gravel pit that afternoon, and into the evening in the barracks while we lay next to each other on our shelf. "Fresh challah bread," I said. "Sauerkraut. Mushroom soup. Stuffed cabbage." "Will you two shut up about food?" a prisoner near us yelled at last. "I can't stand it any longer." Fred and I laughed, but we stopped. It was best that we got as much sleep as we could anyway. We had a hard day's work ahead of us and nothing good to eat. Fred and I became inseparable in the camp. We stood together at roll call, we ate together, we tried to get onto the same work details. We slept beside each other at night. It was good to have a friend. But one day I noticed Fred was slower at chopping wood than he had been the day before, and at dinner he wouldn't eat his bread. "What's wrong, Fred?" "I don't feel good," he told me. He gave me his bread and climbed up into his bed. I saved the bread for him in my pocket. He would want it tomorrow, I was sure. But he didn't want it then. He didn't eat his soup at lunch either. I had to do some of his work at the timber yard to cover for him too. That night, as we lay on our shelf, I whispered to him that he had to get better. "I can't, Yannick, it hurts." "What does?" "My stomach, my head, my throat." Fred was sick. There was no doubt about it, but you couldn't get sick in the camps. Not so sick you couldn't work. There was a camp clinic, but no one wanted to go there. People didn't come back from the camp clinic. "You'll feel better tomorrow," I told Fred. "I saved some bread for you for when you're better." Fred wasn't better the next day. He was worse. He couldn't even get out of bed. "Fred, you have to get up," I told him. "You have to move. The capo will come for you soon." "No," Fred moaned. "No, Yannick. Go. You have to. Go." "What's this? What's going on?" an angry voice demanded. It was our barrack capo. He pushed me aside and poked Fred with his club. "Get up. Time for roll call." "He can't," I told the capo. "He's sick." The capo struck me with his club, sending me to the floor, and I put my hand to my ear and felt blood. "Get up," the capo told Fred again. He hit him with the club, and Fred moaned. I stood up and was about to grab the capo to try and stop him, but the other prisoner took me by the arm. "Come away," he whispered. "Come away, boy." The capo hit Fred again and again. "Fred!" I yelled. "Get to roll call or you'll get a beating," the capo threatened me. "Yannick," Fred moaned. "Go, please." The capo hit him again as the other prisoner pulled me away. "He's going to kill him," I pleaded with the man. "Yes, and he'll kill you too if you interfere. Is that what you want?" I stood in line at roll call watching for Fred. He had to get up. He could make it. He wasn't a Musselman yet. He was just sick. He would get better. Fred arrived at roll call at the very end, but only because he was dragged there by two capos. His face was bloody where they had beaten him, and he hung limp, not even trying to stand. I fought back the tears that came to my eyes. The capos hauled Fred to the front of the assembly yard where the gallows was built. It was a simple thing, just two standing poles with a bar between them. From the pole hung a rope with a noose tied at the end. The two capos lifted Fred's neck into the noose and tightened it, leaving a chair under his feet to keep him from hanging. He was so weak he couldn't even stand, and the rope was cut into his neck, turning his face blue. I choked back a sob. "This man says he cannot work," the Nazis told us. No, he can. He's a good worker. He's just sick. "Work makes you free," the Nazis told us. "But if you cannot work?" The Nazis nodded to the capos, and one of them kicked the chair out from under Fred. He lifted his head for just a moment, long enough to see his horrified face, and then I couldn't watch any more. That night, I said a Kaddish for Fred as I ate his bread and made another vow never to forget. The Death March, 1945, Chapter 21. One morning after roll call at Auschwitz, we were told we were being moved. All of us. I had never counted, but there had to be 5,000 of us at roll call every day, give or take a few hundred. Workers were needed, and the officer of watch told us, and we were being sent to fill their barracks. I could feel the other prisoners tensing around me. If we could have whispered and talked, we would have. Every day, Allied planes flew overhead, and the bombs they dropped got closer, but sometimes at night we would even hear the sound of guns, big guns, tanks, anti-aircraft guns. At the beginning of the war, the Germans had taken fight to France, to Belgium, to Holland, to Russia. Now the fighting was happening in Germany. So when the Nazis said they were moving us to Sachsenhausen because the camp needed workers, none of us believed them. The Allies were getting closer. They were pushing back. And any day now we might be liberated. That was the talk in the barracks. The Nazis were probably moving us away from the front lines. There were no trains to take us to Sachsenhausen, the watch officer told us, so we would walk. That was another good sign for the end of the war, if the Germans had used all their trains for the war effort, but it was bad for us. I had no idea where Sachsenhausen was or how far we would have to go, but just the thought of walking all day made me feel exhausted. I knew there were others I knew who would never make it a kilometer, but walk we would, some in our bare feet and some in our odd-sized wooden clogs, in our thin uniforms, in the middle of winter. The Nazis gave us each a half a loaf of bread and told us it was to last us the whole trip. But how many days would that be? None of us dared to ask. I decided right away that I would eat just a bite of my bread at a time to make it last. If I ended up with extra, I would eat the rest at Sachsenhausen. Under the whips and clubs of capos and SS officers, we marched out through the front of Auschwitz. You come in through the front gate, but the only way you leave is through the chimney, the guards had told us when we arrived. Ha! Look at me now. I want to shout, walking out through the front gate, the way I came in. I survived the ghetto. I'd survived Plazow, the Weslica, and Trzebinka, and Birkenau, now Auschwitz. I was going to survive it all. This was going to be a lie when the Allies liberated us. This, I swore. But nothing had prepared me for the death march. That is what we began to call it, as our numbers dwindled. We marched for hours upon hours each day, stumbling and staggering along as best we could. We walked, and we walked, and we walked, and I began to think there was no Saskatchewan, that the Nazis merely meant to march us to death. Those who could not keep up were shot and left by the roadside. The crack of guns behind us was our constant companion, and you knew you had slowed too much if the guns were getting too loud. Snow fell on us most days, and the dirt road we walked on was frozen when we were lucky, freezing slush when we were not. Those without shoes were the first to fall behind and die. Some tore strips from their canvas jackets and wrapped them around their bare feet, but once the canvas got wet, it was worse. I at least have wooden clogs to keep my feet off of the frozen earth, but without my socks, my feet were blocks of ice anyways. There was no water. We ate snow when we stopped for the night, caught flakes in our tongues as we walked. We slept out in the open. There was no barn or shed to be found, which was most nights sleeping on top of one another like dogs for warmth. The capos and Nazis had fires to keep them warm. At least in the camps we had shelter to keep the weather off of us at night, but out here, the elements killed more prisoners than the guards did. On the 5th day, or was it the 6th? I had lost count. I woke up and I was sure I couldn't go on any farther. My arms and legs were so cold I couldn't make them move in the morning, and I was sure a Nazi would shoot me. But there were others like me, many others. One man's ear had frozen to the ground in the night. The Nazis gave us time to wake and stir before resuming the march, which was a small mercy. Perhaps they just didn't have bullets for us all. As we shambled along later that day, I looked at the men around me. We were skeletons, ghosts, filthy, toothless creatures in oversized, soiled prisoner uniforms. The hair on our heads was growing in thin and scraggly from not too recent shavings. Our fingers were long and bony like vampires from some Hollywood horror movie, and the skin on our faces cracked and drawn back like mummies. The older men had beginnings of beards on their gray skin, and we all walked like zombies, stumbling more than striding, trying to always stay just one step ahead of the Nazis and their guns. Not long ago, all these half-dead creatures around me had been people, I realized. Which of them had been doctors, teachers, musicians, businessmen like my father? Which of the boys had been students like me, playing ball in the streets after school, laughing and calling to friends? It seemed like a lifetime ago. Years. How many years? Like the days I'd begun to lose count. 5 years? 6? Had it been that long? I had been 10 when the war started. That made me 16 years old now. I should almost be done with school and thinking about a career, maybe even university. Mother and father had always wanted me to go to university, but there had been plenty of time to think about that once. Years and years to prepare. Years that were gone now, stolen from me by the Nazis. I closed my eyes, half walking and half sleeping, listening always for the crack of the guns at my heels and to know when to pick up my pace. There was the danger of passing out, of being shot while I slept, but I couldn't help it. I had only half my bread left, tucked into the waist of my pants. I had stretched it as far as it would go, and I still had no energy left to walk. Something droned in the distance, and our shambling column, so much smaller now than when we had begun our journey, slowed to look up. 3 enormous planes flew by, high up in the clouds, raining tiny black specks from their bellies. Bombs. They were Allied planes dropping bombs somewhere in the distance. We heard the rumble of explosions and saw smoke rise over the hill on the horizon. I wanted to cheer them on, to raise my fists and cry, "Yes! Yes! Stick it to the Nazis!" But I knew I had to keep silent. I wasn't sure I had the strength to shout out anyways. The capos cracked their whips and we got moving again, but secretly I was still urging the Allies on to victory. One of the prisoners began to sing. He was Czech, I think. It sounded like Czech, from what I'd heard of in the camps. Bavlador dobre, Bavlador dobre, he sang, his voice weak but insistent. Za naish meldek let bajal vet Jakovkevet. I tensed, sure one of the soldiers would shoot him, but they let him continue. And another prisoner, another Czech farther along the line, joined him, and then another behind me. Then a Pole beside me began to sing, and I recognized the refrain. Hey, 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 falcons past the mountains, forest pits, ring, 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 my little bell in the steep, ring, ring, ring. Sorry, sorry for the girl, for the green Ukraine. Sorry, sorry, your heart is weeping. I'll never see you again. Another Pole looked up. Hey, falcons! With him, and there was a chorus. Then the German Jews began to sing a different song, and the Italian Jews another. I heard a Dutch voice and an English one, and behind me came the most beautiful French voice I had ever heard. Though I didn't understand a word of his song, we sang as we all walked, all of us singing 100 different songs, and the Nazis let us sing. Another small mercy, or perhaps they too missed the way the world had been before the war.